Just please welcome, with a nice round of applause, John Stepek from Bloomberg.
Hey, right, thank you. It's very nice to be here, and thanks for all turning up, and I really appreciate it. I think Peter's done a smashing job with this, and I must admit I'm very impressed. I might have to do that occasionally so I can see his. I like to see the whites of my audience's eyes. Right, so today, for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Stepek. I used to be the editor of Money Week magazine for about 18, well, it wasn't 18 years, but I was there for 18 years. And then about 3 years ago, I moved to Bloomberg. I write a daily email newsletter called Money Distilled, and I do a podcast with Merlin Somerset Webb, who I'm sure a lot of you will know, even if you don't know who I am. So, yes, a financial journalist perspective on Trump, geopolitics and markets. We'll just give a wee chat about what he's been up to and what it all means for us, if anything. So basically, I suppose it's been a bit of a mad year, and it's only August. It feels as though there's been kind of non-stop news. There's a kind of permanent sense of chaos in the air. And also for those of us who are based here in the UK, it often feels as though, despite the words of the song, things can not only not get better, but considerably worse. And yet markets have had a kind of rip-roaring time. And even in the US, which did have a proper kind of hissy fit earlier this year, when US President Donald Trump put tariffs on lots of different things and then kept changing his mind about it, we've since bounced back to all-time highs, albeit not in local currency terms. Now, if you're anywhere near my age or older, that is 50, which is the age at which I'm told life begins. I'm sure a few of you could tell me that that's absolutely the case. It feels very different from the world that we grew up in. Because whenever I was in my 20s, there wasn't really much a 24-hour news cycle. There wasn't any social media. And also, things were different. The 90s were quite an optimistic decade. The Berlin Wall came down and everything was going to be hunky-dory. And as it turns out, that's not how things turned out, unfortunately. But how much of this matters? And how much it's just noise? And what does any of that mean for markets? So that's what we're going to discuss in the next half hour. And I'm going to leave about 10 minutes, ideally, for questions, because I just like to take questions, and we can chat about, honestly, anything, but probably something to do with this. And before we get started, I just want to warn you that the talk you're about to hear is riddled with glib assumptions and sweeping generalizations, and they're all backed up with cherry-picked data that is designed to underpin a narrative that reflects my own prejudices. So, in other words, by the standards of macroeconomics, it's a very rigorous presentation, and you can listen to every word as if it's gospel. But also, more seriously, for anyone who gets any opinions from this, if I accidentally let one slip, please be aware they are my opinions and not the opinions of my employer, Bloomberg. Bloomberg doesn't have opinions. It just is. So anyway, with all that caveat in mind, let's take a step back and get some perspective. As the great poet David Byrne once put it, how did we get here? Now, those of you who are familiar with my work will know that I basically blame 2008 for everything. And that's what I'm going to do today. So prior to the 2008 financial crisis, we had a broad consensus on how the world should work. By a broad consensus, I basically just mean that more people believed this than didn't. It's not as if there weren't people who objected to this stuff, it's just that they were in the minority. So basically, let's kind of run through it very quickly. Technocrats were better than politicians. Supranational organisations like the EU were better than nation states. Open borders are best. Immigration is always and everywhere a net good, and if you don't agree with that, then there's something wrong with you. Soft power is better than hard or actual power. Pax Americana, which is like the US kind of looking after the world, protects us all, except for a small number of bad guys who were like, kind of Iran and North Korea and pretty irrelevant. We had a nice economy. It was non-inflationary, consistently expansionary, and markets were more important than government. One thing we always used to write was, oh, it's great when government's kind of tied up in details and then kind of gridlock, because that means that markets can just get on with stuff, companies can just get on with stuff. And they basically weren't seen as really being terribly important. So you can call this, for want of a kind of better term, maybe the international rules-based order. Now, 2008 fired the starting pistol and all of this, a kind of very long process of change that I feel has taken us to where we are now in 2025. And that's why I think you need to contextualize this stuff, because it will help you understand why Trump is doing what he's doing and what might happen next. Basically, the financial crisis was the tipping point at which a sufficiently large group of people lost faith in the system as it worked and started demanding change, which I think is probably pretty clear from the way that politics has fractured since then. If you go back to 2008 and you look at what's happened in pretty much, not every election, but most elections, in this country, certainly in the US, around the world, every time people are given the opportunity to vote for something different, they take it. Now, most of the time they've been disappointed, but the point is they've been kind of craving something different, they've been looking for something different, and the people who've promised that have been the ones that have won. And I think it's also telling, because the terms left-wing and right-wing don't mean the same things they meant when I was young. And I think that shows you that something big has changed as well. And I do feel the significance of 2008 has been lost a bit, because it's a long time ago now. I was kind of surprised to realise that my kind of oldest daughter's just graduated from uni, and she'd have been about 5 whenever this kind of kicked off. And from her point of view, she hasn't known a world that's any different to this one. And there's people in their 30s now who probably feel that maybe COVID or Brexit was a much more important thing than 2008, which is ancient history to them. I think this is one reason why it's not fully appreciated just how bad it was. I quite often see people making arguments about the UK where they say, why? Usually it's a kind of daft chart. They'll have a line. They'll have a line that goes like this, and it's what GDP was doing up until 2008, and then there's a blip, and then they'll say, oh, but if it had carried on the way it was going before 2008, then everything would be fine now. And you're like, well, of course it's not fine, because we had a bloody huge financial crisis. What did you expect would happen? The last time we had a financial crisis before 2008 was the Depression, a comparable financial crisis. The Depression lasted for, about a decade, and then we had the Second World War. So anyone who feels that 2008 was a blip and we should have been over it by now, I think is a little bit optimistic or slightly misinformed, or is something to sell, because a lot of people feel that the way the world was before the way was the way it should have been, as opposed to one where we built up a lot of imbalances, and which resulted in this. So a financial crisis. Reinhardt and Rogoff, who are a couple of famous economists, they studied 100 episodes of previous kind of banking crises, financial crises, and the average time it took to get out of them was around about 7 years, and that was the average time. So that's including fairly minor financial crises. So again, my point is that if we've spent the last 10 to 15 years feeling a bit gloomy, there is a reason for it, and it was actually sort of predictable at the time once we kind of realised what it was. The other thing is one thing I will say, the Americans did a much better job of fixing their banks overall. But anyway, the other issue with a financial crisis is that it blew away people's confidence in the financial system. And this is a line from a Guardian column by Charlie Brooker, who is the guy that does Black Mirror, the kind of tales of the unexpected for today's modern era. And he wrote a big article about, basically, because he's a non-financial guy, and slightly tongue-in-cheek, But it's about how freaked out the whole thing had left him feeling. And one of the lines from it is, to be told the entire backdrop to our lives may have just been a Crayola sketch on a suspended bedsheet, not a real landscape at all. Well, that's a little scary. So that's what happened in the 2008 financial crisis. People just lost faith in the system and that it would work for them. You'll have heard the political slogan, take back control. Obviously, that was associated with Brexit. It's now associated with a lot of other things because people have jumped on that wagon. People want to feel as if they're in control of their lives. So this was a massive psychological shock. Also, this gives you an illustration of what the problem has been. So the way that we fixed the financial crisis, and this is the other reason why we've got into the issues we have now, is that we did basically a massive extend and pretend job on the entire system. And what that means is we cut interest rates to 0%. The banks were bankrupt. Share prices obviously collapsed. This is the FTSE 350 bank sector from 2007 to now. As you can see, it's basically been in suspended animation for the best part of 2 decades. Now, if I pulled up the US banks, they start to recover around about here because the US did a far better job of rapidly recapitalising its banks and getting them fixed. But this just gives you an illustration of just how bad things have been and why it's taken so long to get things back to anywhere near recovery. And one thing I will say incidentally is that, and you notice it's ticking up towards the end here, it's nice that, or I found it reassuring that Rachel Reeves was not keen on pushing for a new kind of PPI for the people kind of thing with the consumer finance for cars. I think the fact that she kind of pushed back against that and that we aren't going to get a massive compensation scheme from the banks is actually quite a good sign because it shows that there's an element of commitment to getting the economy growing again. Because at the end of the day, the banks are the things that transmit money into your economy. And if they're not healthy, then that's one other reason for the sluggishness of your economy. So basically, the problem with extending and pretending is that extend and pretend is a way to keep assets in the hands of people who already own them. And unfortunately, that means that the people who don't own the assets can't get hold of them. This is most obvious in the housing market. And of course, that really upsets people because young people feel that they can't get onto the housing ladder. They feel as if their lives are on hold. And that provides, if you like, a kind of a petri dish, I guess, that makes it, that breeds the kind of resentment, the irritation, and the feelings that kind of give rise to the more, the kind of, the simmering discontents basically can bubble away. And that basically led to growing backlash against the old way that we did things. And again, I want to avoid the terms elites and populism here, because I feel that those two terms have been extremely, have been weaponized, basically. So, the idea is that, the elites are up here and the populists are down there and the populists are fighting dirty. But in fact, I think what you need to think of it as is the establishment as a system, as being like an immune system. So once you've been doing things for a long period of time, then the world is just set up that way. So it's naturally going to resist any attempts to change it. And a lot of the early attempts to sort of change the system that we had were a little bit, I guess, incoherent. We had people on the far left, we had people on what was described as the kind of far right, but it's probably more slightly kind of nationalistic, trying to work out ways to change the system and make it work better. And kind of like restore confidence in it. And what you had with the establishment was that, for example, David Cameron and the Tories in 2010, they're sort of trying to listen to people, but they're also basically just trying to tell them, look, calm down, we'll sort this, we can go back to the way things were, and you don't need to worry about it. And I guess the thing is, they didn't really take those kind of challenger parties very seriously. And I think, obviously, if they had taken them seriously, then, for example, David Cameron wouldn't have allowed the 2016 EU referendum. And the EU referendum resulted in Brexit. And of course, that then, as much as anything else, or more than anything else, I think is the sort of tipping point. So between here and here, we're looking at, I guess, a system where a lot of people are fed up, but there's still a chance that you can go back to the way that things were. There's still a sense that the kind of establishment is papering over the cracks and that at some point we're going to get back to business as usual. I think in 2016 is the point at which, A, that sort of became no longer possible, and B, it's the point that the establishment went from trying to appease the population, if you like, to actively sort of just try to crack down, really, and control the message much more. So I think this was the point at which people took sides, basically. And this is where you start to get into, so you get Trump gets elected, like I said, you get the UK votes to leave the EU, but there's a lot of resistance. There is a lot of resistance from the establishment to getting out of the EU and also to Trump's first administration. And then what happens in 2020? In 2020, you get COVID. And that provides an excellent opportunity for the establishment forces to come back in. You've got so Biden administration wins. Boris Johnson is kicked out. Liz Truss is rapidly, there's a kind of blip like that. And then Rishi Sunak takes over because people kind of felt like they wanted a safer pair of hands. But obviously nothing gets fixed. And COVID is another massive petri dish, forgive the phrase, for more simmering discontent, for people being at home. And so when they get the opportunity to, in this country, kick out the Conservative Party, but B, in the US, Trump makes a comeback because obviously the kind of Democrats had Joe Biden, and then they had that terrible kerfuffle at the end where they were saying he was okay, and then it turns out he wasn't okay, and they had to replace him at the last minute. And so basically, we end up with Labour under Keir Starmer, but we've got Donald Trump in the US. And the thing is, Trump 2.0 is much, much, much more serious than Trump 1.0 in terms of pushing things through. He's been there before. He knows where the resistant points are. And what he's done is he's actually started making a difference. I mean, one of the, it's fascinating. He is the first world leader to be giving people the change that they've been voting for. Now, whether or not they actually want that change is a different matter. They might sort of start to feel that, well, actually, this isn't exactly what I voted for. And certainly when the stuff about tariffs was coming out, people were getting a bit freaked out. But he does have, I'm not going to go so far as to say it's a game plan, but he does recognise where the points are that people are kind of fed up with. So he's moving to a world where it's back where politicians know their place. They've been elected. They're elected by the people to do things. So they are, bigger than the technocrats, again, like the central banks. Nation states are more important than supranational organizations. Protectionism's fine if it's in the national interest. Acknowledges that too much immigration, or says that too much immigration can sometimes be detrimental. Hard power greater than soft power. Pax Americana. Something that every kind of US leader has complained about is that Europe doesn't spend enough money on defence. Since at least Obama, this has been a complaint. But Trump just said, well, look, we're not going to pay for you anymore, so you better get your finger out. And amazingly, Germany then turned around and said, oh, actually, well, no, we will then. And that's been great news for European stocks, because the idea that Germany will go from being this sort of deflationary sort of influence within the Eurozone to actually spending money is deemed to be a good thing. But it means also all of this that we're going to have a more sluggish and more inflation-prone economy, because if you're throwing sand in the gears of global trade and you're throwing sand in the gears and you're making borders stickier, then that just has to end up pushing up prices. It has to end up making trade more difficult. It has to end up making things more complicated. So there are plenty of reasons to not necessarily like it, but the point is he is giving people what they voted for. And I find it fascinating that this is the first time that it's happened, because what's interesting is obviously Labour here got into power and they're very much more, more keener to have things back the way that they were. I mean, nothing says rule-based international order than paying another country to take some islands off your hands. On the say-so of a kind of international court that doesn't actually have any particular, influence over you. But the thing is, they live in Trump's world, because America is the most powerful country. So I don't think that we're going to go back the way. I think that the lines have now been drawn. I think that the rules of engagement, if you like, have changed. And I think this is the world that we're going to have to get used to living in from now on. And like I said, it's got its upsides and it's got its downsides, but one thing is that it is kind of what people were voting for. And more importantly, the market couldn't care less. So this is the thing about geopolitics as well. We just spent a good bit of time talking about it and the various issues that are involved, but geopolitics is not necessarily something that's going to scupper the kind of investment bull market. Now here you had the S&P kind of fell sharply, but again, it's bounced right back. Why is it bounced right back? I think that's a very, I think there's a mixture of things. I think one is that people are very used to investing in the US. The US just has momentum. It's been the best investment for a long time. That dies hard. The AI bubble, because the other thing that freaked out markets here was that DeepSeek came out, the Chinese AI. That seems to have certainly not died a death, but it's gone away. Excitement about AI, excitement about the AI rollout is massive. So that's continued to rise. And basically, there's just, it's going up because there's no particular reason at the moment for it to go down, but also because it's August. And that's the S&P in pound sterling. As you can see, the place where the US is really taking a hit from this change of heart, and actually my colleague Merlin called it America's Brexit for one of these reasons, is that it's the dollar that's taking the hit in terms of asset prices. But even then, although most of the European markets have beaten the US in kind of constant currency terms this year, the US is catching right back up. Now, do I think that this can continue? I mean, of course, like anything can continue. But the only thing I would say is that US markets are, and this is where it matters more than the geopolitics, US markets are very expensive. They have been expensive for a long time, I entirely admit that. They are getting overstretched again, low even by those standards. The concentration in the MSCI index of the top 10 stocks is back at a high. So 70% of the MSCI World Index is taken up by American stocks. Now, I think the UK is in third place, believe it or not, at 3.5%. So the point is, it's very much the dominant player, and that is unusual. This is the tariff take. So this is the amount of money that the tariffs have taken so far, and they should keep taking more. And the point is that money's got to come from somewhere. Now, is it getting paid for by the exporters? I mean, maybe a little bit. Is it getting paid for by the consumers? Probably a little bit. Haven't really seen that in the data yet. So it's probably coming out of corporate margins for just now. And this is part of the reason for the Trump tariffs. Part of the reason for the Trump tariffs is because the US, obviously, like every other developed economy, is up to its neck in debt. One way to increase corporation tax effectively, without actually saying that that's what you're doing or having to get that past Congress, is to put the tariffs on, because that's what, I mean, you saw NVIDIA is going to get charged 15% on every specific chip that it sells to China. So it's just ways of getting basically for the US government to dip its beak. I mean, to be honest, I think the tariffs has been the ultimate stealth tax. It's almost like a Gordon Brown maneuver from Donald Trump, but instead of targeting your pension, he's just putting that kind of few basis points in corporation tax. Where are we? And the other point I'd make is that US outperformance is not a God-given right. So this is from Schroders. My friend Duncan Lamont over there sent me a copy of this. And these are really useful, these returns quilts, because they just show you how things change from year to year. And I mean, your first conclusion should probably be that nobody really, knows anything. Because, look at the colour of that. It's called a quilt for a reason. But if you look at the top one, the US has done very, very well. And the returns have been exceptional for about a decade. But it's only about a decade. Whenever you talk to people these days, they act as if the US has always been top of the game, and it's just simply not the case. I mean, the US was the bottom all the way through the early 2000s, and it was emerging markets that were top, and that was mostly because of the commodities boom. And then before that, it's been kind of a mishmash, really. So I think the thing to understand is that there's nothing wrong with this. It's not an aberration. It happens sometimes that one market does a lot better than the others for a while, but it's not, it's not written in the stars, and it's not written in the stars that it will continue either. So what I'm saying is, I'm not saying, go out and sell your S&P 500 trackers. I'm not saying, get out of the US market whatsoever. I'm nothing like that. But the point is, this is probably a good time to consider how diversified your portfolio is, particularly with the fact that the kind of geopolitical turmoil is going to continue. And while a lot of that will be ignored by markets, there are elements of it that will, surprise people and lead to adjustments. And so I think that just now it's probably more important than it has been for a while to be diversified. One other interesting point was that in the US itself, US investors apparently have been expanding their portfolios outside of the US in a way that they haven't done for quite some time, according to kind of Schroders data. Still plenty of people buying. It's just, the point is that the valuation that it's at and the environment that we're in, I think it makes sense to have a bit of diversification in your portfolio and then your equities portfolio. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about, and isn't on the slides, are the things that I actually think are genuinely important when it comes to the geopolitics side of things, or even, not even geopolitics, the politics side of things. If you're a UK investor and you're in this room right now, then one thing that you're probably thinking about is what's going to happen in the autumn budget. And this is a way that governments, getting away from big, highfalutin kind of like macro stories about, what's been going on, really can mess you about. And it's all about your personal finances. So there's nothing that I can suggest to you, and I can't give you the inside scoop on what might happen in autumn. And I haven't got any kind of kite flying to do or anything like that. But one thing I would suggest is that you probably need to make sure that you're actually on top of your personal finances. You need to make sure you're on top of where your pension is, where your ISAs are, and just be aware of what's going on with your money. Because one problem with moving from one regime to another is that now basically everything's up for grabs. The inheritance tax imposition on pensions, I have to say, didn't surprise me because it's been an open target for quite a while. But the problem is it's been left like that for so long that a lot of people have made legacy plans that involve sheltering money from IHT in their pension. And so now that's been taken away, that's going to cause all manner of trouble for people. And I was just reading this morning, on Bloomberg obviously, that they might be looking at other ways of targeting inheritance tax, such as with maybe like a lifetime cap on the number of gifts you can give, which sounds like an absolute admin nightmare to me, but they are kind of desperate because Rachel Reeves doesn't want to break her her fiscal rules, and she doesn't want to break the manifesto, which means that unfortunately we're going to end up with probably the daftest and least popular way of raising taxes, which will be either kind of something on inheritance tax or possibly looking at even more stuff in pensions. So that's my sort of advice, not advice, it's never advice, my opinion on that kind of thing is that you should just be on top of what you're doing and know, basically where everything is. I'm sure that most of you, because you're in this room, are probably on top of your affairs, but if you're not, get it sorted before the autumn budget. And the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of geopolitical carnage, and this one's a little bit, I suppose, I had never really thought about getting a second passport before because I've already fled one repressive regime in another country and I don't want to do it again. I'm quite happy in the wee bit of England I'm settled in. Apologies to any Nicola Sturgeon fans out there. But now my kids are kind of like adults and I'm thinking, well, I mean, I'm broadly optimistic in the future for the UK, but at the same time, there's probably a bit more of me that's thinking, right, well, what if it's always kind of rubbish at doing things? You know, or what if a government gets in that really is not just, you know, left, but actually kind of far left? And I don't know, I mean, maybe that's just age, but there's a bit of me that thinks that investing in a second passport, if you have the wherewithal to do so, is not a bad insurance policy. I'd rather not use it, but it's not a bad one. And the other thing, obviously, is the old favourite, which is gold. Because obviously a nice thing about gold is that, you know, if you own the physical, then you can take it with you wherever you end up going. I always think it's interesting because I remember they don't do it so much now because gold's gone up a lot, but I remember in the 2000s when I started talking about gold, people would say, oh, but, you know, if there's a zombie apocalypse, you can't spend it in Tesco. And you're like, yeah, but you need to understand something, right? There's a big gap between life being normal and the whole world ending. You know, like it's interesting. The people who kind of look at gold that way are among the most, I hate to use this buzz term, but geopolitically privileged that you can think of. Because if you know anyone who's actually fled a kind of country or just left and had to kind of avoid capital controls. And for example, my dad used to know a guy who had left, I think it was South Africa, it might have been Zimbabwe, in the 1960s. And one of the ways that he'd got his money out of South Africa and into Portugal was by smuggling a load of gold coins in the back of a washing machine. So this is the point, it's like the world does not have to end for a disaster hedge to be useful. Your particular world, you know, can get into trouble. Same with people in Venezuela who ended up buying Bitcoin and then sending it across the border that way. So the point is, you know, if you're looking for something that's just going to help you sleep at night because you're a bit worried about the way things are going politically, then a second passport and gold, and maybe crypto. I'm like that about crypto. I mean, I'm not skeptical. I think it's a thing. I just struggle with assets that I really don't know how to value. The one thing with gold is that at least it's got, you know, kind of 1,000-odd years of history. So you can have a rough idea. Whereas with something like Bitcoin, I mean, yeah, hands up, I should have got in ages ago. But I'm just saying, I think it's kind of, I can see what it's for. I can see that it's useful for moving money around. I just don't know if I'd buy it at $120,000 or not. And I'm sure there's people in here who've got views on either side of that. So I think that's me. I'm just, where are we? I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions, I think. So if anybody's got any questions, then please put up your hands or debate or anything like that.
Squeeze a few in. Start over here, nice and close.
This might be an overly complicated question, but
I love them. Make sure it's a statement rather than a question. That's my favourite.
So if we look back at like the two major kind of like economic crises of the 20th century, you've got the Great Depression and then the inflation era of the 70s. Both of those produced new economic models. Keynesianism coming out of the Great Depression, and then the kind of Friedman coming out of the inflation era. Yeah. Do you think that one of the reasons why we are stuck where we are is that no one's doing any big thinking about a new way of running governments?
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think the obvious conclusion to all this is there is a realignment, and actually the person who's doing that realignment, believe it or not, is Trump. He's kind of like changing the position of the US within the global economic system and basically tearing down much of the old global economic order in the process. Now, again, don't get me wrong, I don't think this will be the end to it, because obviously, I mean, one of the subjects we haven't covered here, or haven't touched on much, is the massive amount of government debt. So there needs to be a way to get rid of that. That may be through inflation. Actually, I think it probably will be through inflation, a kind of inflationary reset of some sort. But the other interesting thing that Trump and his team are doing is taking stable coins in particular very seriously. And they sort of clearly see stable coins as another source of demand for the US Treasury market. So stablecoin is just a cryptocurrency backed by the dollar, but they basically underpin the whole crypto trading universe. So if you've effectively sort of got a backdoor way for US Treasuries to be back in the whole Bitcoin sphere. So yeah, well, actually, yeah, and that is an interesting way to look at it. Actually, that is a more complicated question. That's something we can talk about later on.
Yeah, Gavin Palmer. One of the things which has been missed or picked up in some of the things, the UK basically created 400 billion in COVID, and then America, basically all the main countries did the same thing. Now, that's equivalent to about 30% of the UK economy. So if you were playing a game of Monopoly, then you've got 30% more money, but you've got the same number of assets. So the asset classes are all going to go up, even without any change in the amount of assets or the type of assets.
I mean, yeah, that's to an element that's what happened. I mean, it's not quite as straightforward as that, but definitely if the money supply goes up. I mean, one of the things, whenever COVID hit, and everyone was in lockdown, and they decided to print a load of money to deal with that, my first thought was, yeah, inflation's going to go up. Inflation's going to go up quite a lot. And it did go up quite a lot. And I think now we're stuck with it. I think inflation is here. It's not necessarily going to be like the 1970s, but I think it's going to be volatile for a long time. And the other thing I think you've got to look at is that you look at the Bank of England and you look at the Fed, and you look at where inflation is, and you look at where interest rates are, and all the talk is still about interest rates coming down. Now, that may or may not be a good idea. I don't want to necessarily kind of prejudge that. But it's not, the inflation target is not something these guys are thinking about. They're not thinking, I need to get inflation down to 2% or I'm going to lose my job. So I think that inflation's here to stay because it's more politically convenient and it's definitely more economically convenient than deflation. Yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I worked as a contractor for the European Commission in Ukraine with the State Security Service before 2008, and I saw very, very clearly there that the European Commission, and by extension the European Union, was not up to the job of what was coming, big time. Serious question. But my question is, you highlighted gold. Are there any other commodities which we might regard as the new gold in that they are seriously geopolitically significant? Not just the rare earths, but maybe copper, an obvious example.
I take your point. Again, I think it's a good one, and it's quite a well-known investment thesis now. I agree. I don't think anything's the new gold because I think gold is money rather than a raw material. But copper's certainly massively important for electrification. There'll probably continue to be demand for that. You've got, and the other point is that if you're in an environment where there's more protectionism and where imports and exports have a strategic value rather than just a purely financial one, then that's naturally going to result, supply chains will be kind of messed up. Countries will have a reason to deprive their rivals of certain materials. And none of that matters, as in, what I mean is none of it is really a big problem in terms of actual supply, because despite the name, obviously, rare earth metals are not that rare. You can get them somewhere else. You just don't want to pay the price to dig them out of the ground in Australia or Canada, as opposed to digging them out of the ground in, the Congo or whatever. But if the price goes up enough, you absolutely will. But obviously, if the price goes up enough, that'll also have a knock-on effect to all the products that we, buy and use them in. So no, definitely, I would have thought in a more inflationary world, commodities, it's always tricky to invest in commodities. I mean, mining equities are usually the sort of easiest option. Yeah, exactly, cyclical, very cyclical. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think in a more inflationary world, commodities are generally quite a good bet.
One more question, John, and then we're going to have to close.
No problem.
Thank you very much. Here we go. Thank you.
Hey, John. Thanks very much. Yeah, you've presented a world which is obviously very different going forward. And obviously this country, last year, the Labour government came in with its very Keynesian, I guess, ideas in terms of growth and fiscal stimulus. And now that we're 1 year on and that hasn't materialised, you've presented a world where, okay, we need to worry about second passports and inheritance tax. Now, I guess my question is, what's your best guess in terms of how this is going to materialise over the next 3 or 4 years? I mean, I think we've probably all got our own ideas here, but it's like, what do you think? I mean, given that they've said their plan is to lay the land in terms of the next few months before the budget, and clearly they're saying inheritance tax and rules about that are on the table. It seems that we're definitely onto a slope here where if there's no growth and there's no, policies that are going to deal with welfareism, that is the only track that we're going to go into, and it seems like a direct line into capital controls. Am I right, or am I,
Look, it's definitely a possibility, and it's one that I'm a bit worried about, because you're basically talking about the doom loop. Taxes go up, they actually raise less tax because they put tax up so high, and then, they've public spending, they've refused to cut public spending, etc., etc. And eventually, I suppose the eventual end to that road is that the gilts market might kind of vomit, but even then, that's the sort of thing that could take a very long time. What I think is more likely, because it's clear to me that even if they don't know what to do, and I think this is partly about the changing landscape, they do understand that they kind of need to get to grips with the kind of, for example, the small boats side of things. If they want to get re-elected, they need to get to grip with the growth issue. And they need to get a grip on just making people feel better, having made everyone feel terrible when they came into power and imposed employee national insurance. And I think the most obvious way to do that is, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already, if I'm honest. And I think that sort of maybe says something about the kind of leader that Keir Starmer is. But basically, you kind of need to get rid of the fiscal rule, but in a persuasive way that enables you to say, look, we're going to sit down, we're going to think properly, we are going to trim welfare, but we're going to do it in a considered manner, as opposed to just cutting off, winter fuel allowance at X level. Also that we're going to take time thinking about what taxes and tax reforms, like maybe reform council tax is one option you could do that although it might not be popular, it would possibly be actually kind of a sensible thing to do, as long as you took away some other taxes in the meantime. But doing that and doing it in a persuasive way would avoid a kind of gilt strike, because I don't think the gilts market is itching to blow up. It's just that we got that impression because of the Liz Truss episode, which I won't bore you with, but it wasn't all just because she decided to, knock the 45p tax rate on the head. I think that's it. I mean, I read a good piece from Anatol Kaletsky from Gavical, where he was saying, look, the way out of this is we ditch the fiscal rule and we ditch the manifesto commitment. We put income tax up by, say, 2p in the pound. We widen the tax base again, so we're not reliant on a tiny kind of pillar of very well-off people. And that would get things going again. So I think that's more likely. And that's why I'm hoping I won't have to use my second passport, because applying for a Polish passport is a pain in the neck.
Need to leave it there, John. But thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Stepek from Bloomberg. Thank you, John. Smashed it.